Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for a special vaccine COVID-19 waiver episode of our show, All the Goods Trade Puns Were Taken, our fortnightly show where we try to break down what's important or just what's funny in trade news over the last 2 weeks. You might notice straight away that we are a co-host short. Anna Isaacs is off this week, likely because she doesn't want to be seen with us talking about a controversial topic. We wish her a swift return so that we can once again be properly adult supervised. But we do have with us, Sam Lowe, the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for European Reform and the author of the newsletter Most Favoured Nation. Sam, I saw you released an absolutely huge MFN on Friday covering about 37 topics. Are you going to run out of steam?
I'm worried I might run out of things to write about at some point. Yes, that's certainly a concern.
I was gonna say because I feel like I ran out of trade things to say 3 years ago. So your ability to come up with 4 or 5 topics every fortnight is utterly laudable. So my hat off to you. So on this episode, what we wanted to do is, rather than our usual format where we tackle about 4 or 5 issues, is really dive down deep into a step-by-step explanation of something we think is really important, which is this COVID-19 waiver announcement from the US. And we really wanted to take you through step-by-step, right from the very fundamentals through to some of the really complex technical detail around all of this. And so Sam and I are going to do our best to do that. But as always, we really encourage you to jump in the chat, stop us, ask questions. If some jargon slips in, just yell at us until we define it. So please do get engaged. That's the beauty of this format.
Yeah, my favourite bit maybe of the last edition of this was when we found ourselves talking about tax, only to discover that half the audience were tax lawyers. That was a high.
Yes, if anybody in the audience is a vaccine supply chain procurement expert, you have to tell us now. It's the law. It's like if somebody asks you if you're a cop, you have to tell them. So please do let us know before we embarrass ourselves. But we will do our best with the limited knowledge that we have. So the big news that we want to talk about is the fact that the United States, effectively President Biden and the USTR have announced that the United States is open to negotiations towards an eventual waiver for COVID vaccines from the TRIPS agreement. Now, Sam, what is TRIPS?
The big one. TRIPS is a WTO agreement, the trade-related. God, I've frozen, Dmitry.
No.
What does it stand for? No, come on.
Trade-related aspects of intellectual property.
Yes, that's the right one. Yes, sorry, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. So it's a WTO agreement that looks at intellectual property. It means that members of the WTO who party to the agreement have an obligation to recognise the intellectual property rights of and patents of companies that have lodged these patents in other member states. And it's an obligation to do this. It doesn't necessarily mean they will do it or will do it very well. But they are all meant to try. And it's not unlimited. There are exemptions to this under certain circumstances. Countries can engage in compulsory licensing where they sort of waive the recognition of a manufacturer's intellectual property in order to allow domestic producers to produce the same thing, but there's certain procedures that go along with that, and the like. And it's something that's been fairly controversial throughout the history of the WTO, in that it's the sort of protection of intellectual property has often been viewed as a priority for rich countries and not necessarily developing countries who may feel that they would gain more of an advantage from being able to ignore intellectual property at time, and that would be good for their domestic manufacturing capacity and allow them to scale up more quickly.
The kind of meta argument behind all of this is things like a vaccine or a medicine or really any piece, or a movie, any piece of intellectual property takes a lot of it takes like hundreds of $millions to make the first one, but often not that much money to make the second, third, and onward one. So the argument is that you have to incentivize intellectual property creators to spend that money to create things by basically giving them a short-term monopoly on it after they've made it. So that immediately upon releasing it, other people can't just free ride on their work by making 1 million copies and selling them. That's kind of the thought process. Though whether the current agreement gets it right in terms of how long that monopoly is, how broad that monopoly is, whether that's even the way the market works, is really contentious. And specifically around vaccines, I think, and really a lot of medicines, given the government investment to make it happen, that makes it even more controversial.
Yeah, and I suppose sometimes people sort of frame it as a moral argument as well, and it's quite easy to conceptualize in that if you think, if I have written a book, do I want to be able to have the financial benefits of that being published for a period of time? Yes. How long's a just period of time? Is it my lifetime? Maybe lots of people would agree with that. Is it my lifetime plus another 70 years? Ooh.
Disney would agree with that.
Disney would agree with that, right? Exactly. So that's where the debate gets in, and then I think the point you made about medicines and vaccines sort of being a special category is very apt, because in the last big TRIPS argument was when HIV was very prevalent, and there was discussions around the medication there. It gets very contentious very quickly when you consider the amount of lives at stake and the amount of investment coming in, not only from the companies themselves but from governments. Just to repeat what you just said.
Yes, I appreciate the echo.
Yes.
But I think the really key thing for people to understand about TRIPS right away is the nature of the agreement. So if TRIPS were to go away tomorrow, that wouldn't mean that intellectual property isn't protected in your country. It just means that if your country chose not to protect the intellectual property of foreign companies could no longer take issue with that at the WTO, or it wouldn't be breaking international law in doing so. So basically what TRIPS says is, you, WTO member, have to have a system of like patent courts, like a way to file patents, a way to file copyright, and you have to actually, if someone does have a patent in your country, you have to protect it. You can't just kind of look the other way while it's looked at. So that is kind of TRIPS, and it's really important to understand where it, I guess, fits into that architecture, right? So that kind of brings us down to what's the TRIPS waiver? What is being sought?
Well, so it depends who you ask, right? As in there's the US, not the US, the Indian and South African proposal. But I think the thing that's really made the news recently has been the US putting forward the idea that it would accept in principle the idea of a waiver on COVID-related vaccines, which means that if this waiver were to be passed, countries would no longer be obliged under their TRIPS obligation to recognise the patents associated with COVID vaccines. But of course, going back to what you just said, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden those countries won't stop recognising those patents. It just means that they could choose not to, and it wouldn't be inconsistent with their WTO obligations as it may have been before, although that is a subject for debate.
And this is where a lot of the debate comes in, basically saying like, were countries really not taking measures that would have been life-saving because the WTO obligations said not to? And the question is, and that's a complicated question, and quite a loaded one. It would be amazing if people really did respect the WTO rules quite that much, but it would be perhaps a different world. But the argument is there's a huge kind of symbolic thing to this. So Sam, let's kind of take it in turns, and we'll both put on our sort of advocacy hats. And if you were to make the strongest possible case for the waiver, what's the strongest case you've heard? What's the strongest case you can make?
Oh, that's a challenge. I'm going to need to return to my campaigning days and maybe slip on my hemp sandals.
I pray that.
Yeah. So the strongest argument in favour of it is that the TRIPS obligations that countries are under provides a legal route for countries to challenge the actions of countries that may or may not choose to ignore patents when and allow their own companies to produce the patents as well, so as to provide the vaccines very quickly to your own populations. So I'm finding this difficult, and the reason I'm finding this difficult to advocate for is that TRIPS obligations already have a way out. Sorry, I'm going over to your side, but it's already possible for countries to engage in compulsory licensing, which allows them to ignore their TRIPS obligations. You know, there's a step to it. You have to negotiate with a company that makes it in the first place, and then if you can't sort of get anywhere, then you can ignore your TRIPS obligations and allow a domestic company to make the vaccine. You know, and as long as you pay the company off who originally made it, it's all okay. So maybe the argument in favor of a waiver is you wouldn't have to pay them and you wouldn't have to go through this whole process, and you could do it quicker. But I suppose my argument in favor of the waiver is it potentially provides more leverage for countries when negotiating with pharmaceutical companies, in that they now have quite a big incentive, if they don't want this waiver to come through, to find extra capacity to license their vaccine to more partners and to provide it more cheaply, particularly now the US is on board. And with the US being on board, countries are perhaps not so scared that if they do go the compulsory licensing route, that the US will step in and start making trouble for them. So I think the argument in favor is largely a political economy one rather than anything practical. I don't think waiving the license or getting negotiations about waiving the TRIPS obligations to do with COVID vaccines is going to lead to more injections in more arms more quickly. But it could help with some processes down the line.
We need to add like a lawyer co-host that can argue any position regardless, just the drop of a hat. But I mean, if you massively oversimplify the position, which I don't know is necessarily fair, but if you massively oversimplify the position, it's a pretty simple one, right? We need a lot more vaccine than we are currently producing. If it is even remotely possible that there is a single potential factory out there anywhere in the world that is currently not producing vaccine because it can't get the patents, it can't afford the patents, its government isn't comfortable using this mechanism because it's afraid of retaliation. It's just like, if this waiver shakes one factory loose, then that's potentially eventually more needles in arms. And there's also the argument, I think I've also heard, saying, okay, you know, obviously a lot of the campaigning rhetoric to get this done was about needles in arms today. But COVID's going to be with us in one horrible mutated form or another for a while. These kind of diseases are going to be with us for a while. If this waiver lets developing countries build up their capacity to manufacture this domestically, then even if they don't make it in time for this, for this pandemic or this step of the pandemic, won't we be in a better place? And what have we really lost? You
can perhaps argue, and I think it's a compliment to yours, that it removes something we sometimes refer to as regulatory chill. This idea that if you pursue a certain course of action, there are consequences, and the waiver removes the fear of those consequences, which perhaps opens up domestic policy space and allows countries to take actions they would otherwise have been slightly cautious about taking. And maybe there is some benefit there. And I'm finding it very odd, sort of being a bit negative about it, because I'm largely quite skeptical about intellectual property as a tool for, as sort of something that incentivizes innovation and the like beyond a certain point. I'm not arguing it shouldn't exist. I'm just sort of saying maybe it's gone a bit too far. But in this specific instance, I mean, I'm finding it slightly difficult to see why spending a lot of political capital on this particular negotiation, it will be a negotiation, is the thing to do right now, when the actual reason vaccines aren't getting arms are largely around supply shortages, countries not export prohibitions and the like, rather than intellectual property rules.
And I think Pathetic One's got a point, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more about like why specifically the US backing this deal so important. But the chill is as much diplomatic as regulatory, which is this kind of concept of, yeah, okay, the TRIPS agreement says that you can use like an Article 31 point whatever to theoretically compulsory license now, and really, the WTO dispute settlement system is broken anyway. So that's not what's holding you back. What's holding you back is this idea that taking any of these steps might have diplomatic consequences for you from the traditional champions of intellectual property, which, by the way, happen to be the world's largest aid donors, for example. USAID is a big deal in a lot of developing countries. So is DevCo and German development and Australian and New Zealand development money in the Pacific. So are there consequences, diplomatic aid, all sorts of things, for blatantly disrespecting this, no matter what this is? So a waiver that was supported and signed by everybody would give people the confidence that there's no diplomatic consequences as long as you stay within the eventually negotiated waivers COVID-19 box, which is a kind of different discussion. Okay, so Sam's already done it because he's apparently the worst advocate you could have on your side.
No, I'm one of the best advocates because I only argue it if I believe it.
It sounds like a terrible advocate.
Well, maybe not a good advocate, but I've got integrity.
Oh, that's a massive burden. God, I dropped that week one at DFAT. Okay, so very briefly, what is the argument against, and we've heard a lot of them already. There's kind of two streams to this argument. The first one is what Sam said. This probably won't get that many needles into arms this month, this quarter, possibly this year, even if it was signed tomorrow. This is how the argument goes. Basically, there are a huge number of barriers between where we are today and more vaccine production, and IP this is how the argument goes, isn't a principal one of that. So having all of civil society, all of this attention, the WTO, focused on removing what is at most a tertiary barrier is a distraction from what we should be really doing, and there's lots of thoughts about what that is. Anything from a Operation Warp Speed worldwide, which is I think an idea Chad Bowen and others have put forward, where you basically just pour billions of dollars into every element of the supply chain worldwide.
And that's the argument, right? Because if we just assume that, and this is, I think, is a very justified assumption, that the return on investment for every £1 or $1 spent is greater than one, especially at this stage of the pandemic, then you can spend as much money as you want, and it will be worth it. And my sort of feeling often on these things is, then just throw a huge amount of money at everything. I'm with Chad on this.
And people make this argument about the IP question too. They're basically just well, if you think the issue is that a bunch of developing countries can't afford to license from Pfizer, well, pay Pfizer for it.
Yeah. Step
in and go, cool, you've got factory capacity, Pfizer's got the patent, you can't afford to pay for Pfizer's patent, that's cool, we got you. We're Germany, we're borrowing at negative 0.5% bond rates. Money's free, woo. Take a bunch of it, go and make some vaccines, spread it around the region. We can't beat COVID until everybody's beaten COVID. That's kind of this is the argument on what should we be doing instead. I think the counter argument is you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Which, you can have this IP fight, which is important, it's galvanized civil society, and it could help. But at the same time, we can also have a discussion about what can we usefully do with the power of the purse to get the supply chain issues sorted.
And I think the two then, when you sort of put them next to each other like that, it all sort of begins to have a tactical perspective. If you're thinking about why is the US doing this and why is it doing it like this, in that it knows it can spend a lot of money. It has been spending a lot of money. It's going to continue spending a lot of money. But perhaps it would like to cap just how much money it spends. And then all of a sudden, this threat of companies losing out on their intellectual property rights when it comes to the production of these drugs becomes quite a useful negotiating tool. And I know that there's, I'm sort of in this camp, but there's quite a few people who think that maybe we will never ever see this waiver actually be agreed or be negotiated, or not anytime soon, But in the meantime, it will be used as a threat by the US and others when it comes to their negotiation with pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, so that argument kind of runs something like this. In addition to the IP, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we basically need pharmaceutical companies to do if we're going to get these vaccine production numbers up, including things like what's called tech transfer, which is basically to help some of these factories in the developing world with the expertise and the technological methods that they need to produce these drugs, even once they have the patent or the rest of it. Pharmaceutical companies have a bunch of reservations about doing this under certain circumstances. They want to be paid certain amounts. They have concerns about, some of these production methods and trade secrets aren't COVID specific.
Mm-hmm.
If you spent $1 billion, doing whatever it is to make mRNA work, you can use that for lots of different things, and they're worried about that going out of their hands, so they're reluctant. This is basically the US turning around to them and saying, we have previously had your back for the last 40 years, and we have aggressively enforced your IP everywhere in the world, almost to the inclusion of a lot of other things. We no longer have your back on that when it comes to COVID. And if this situation keeps going, we're going to get pushed in that direction, and people are just going to start taking your trade secrets, and we're not going to stop them. So the best thing you can do as a big pharmaceutical company is to make sure that no one's tempted to do that by playing ball as much as possible with us and with developing countries. This whole issue goes away if there's suddenly 20 billion doses of vaccine a year because you've done everything you can possibly do. That's kind of the argument.
Is it the galaxy brain take, or is it where does it sit on the spectrum? I think that's the most probable, right?
I think it's probable that is a line of thinking USTR has. How effective? Because you kind of, on the one hand, pharmaceutical companies are now very, very angry.
Yeah.
They're incredibly angry. And so you kind of have this trade-off where you generated a bunch of theoretical leverage with them. But on the flip side, you have massively antagonized people you really, really need and who are finding
who have been doing quite a good job of late, right? So I think Big Pharma has had maybe its best couple of years of my lifetime, right? In terms of public perception, in terms of ability to deliver, they got together a vaccine remarkably quickly. And of course, there've been some hiccups along the way. There's been politics within Europe around a certain manufacturer, but generally people are feeling quite good about them. And now all of a sudden they're getting kicked. You can sort of see why they might be upset by this.
There was an amazing story out of the US where a trial lawyer was complaining that it's now really hard to convince juries to award settlements against drug companies for completely non-COVID related damages when some drug has side effects or whatever, because juries are for the first time in human history sympathetic to Big Pharma. Suddenly Pfizer's polling at 68% approval rating, and juries no longer want to slap around big pharma companies. So yeah, there is that kind of trade-off. And look, from the pharmaceutical company's perspective, and also to an extent the US perspective, they're also looking at with one eye on whether this is the sharp end of the sword. I look at the fact that when this waiver was announced, AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the sort of hugely popular, very prominently left-wing U.S. member of the House of Representatives, her immediate reaction was amazing. Now do insulin.
Yeah.
And I don't blame her. I'm like, yes, you should do baby insulin.
Well,
maybe that patent should just be lapsed.
Well, I know everyone in Europe looking at the U.S. healthcare system, going,
Yeah, I mean that's we can do that traumatic discussion some other time.
Yes. People.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Smorty, because people do point to the fact that the COVID vaccine is a special case because so many of the companies that made it took massive amounts of public funds to do it. The kind of flip side to that argument is that a lot of the companies that did that are not making a profit on this or are not protecting the IP. So I think AstraZeneca basically said they're not going to enforce their patents on COVID-19 anyway.
Was that Moderna, I think?
Maybe it was Moderna.
I'm not sure. AstraZeneca are doing it at cost, and they might have said something else as well. But anyway, they're not, at least in the first instance, making a huge amount of money from it. Yeah.
Whereas kind of, I think Pfizer developed it almost entirely with their own money. So they deliberately didn't take public funds in order to sell it. But then the Pfizer vaccine, as I understand it, is something of a rich country vaccine, because in order to store and distribute it, you need quite a robust, I think, supply chain, in terms of like cold storage and stuff. This is way outside my area of expertise, but this was my understanding, that it was always going to go to developed countries. There wasn't that much capacity, to send it elsewhere. But yeah, so this is kind of the other argument that you hear against, just to be fair to both sides of the argument, even though apparently Sam and I both are both doing both cases somehow.
Yeah, sorry.
No, but I did the same thing. The other case against it, which is, I guess, the more dangerous case, is saying, does this have the opportunity to undermine trust in vaccines? And the argument goes something like, okay, you waive patent protection. Does that lead a bunch of countries or a bunch of factories that maybe aren't fully equipped to do it, to take a punt on trying to make, hi Hans Mangus, thanks for following, to basically, try to make the vaccine and then run into problems, potentially hurt some people, and thus undermine global confidence in vaccines, full stop. Because you're basically saying anybody can make AstraZeneca now. And so do you have the chance to undermine that brand by having, countries are going to be under a lot of regulatory pressure to basically just approve factories to get the vaccine made? Is this going to lead to dangerous vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, because of cheap knockoffs, right? So it's similar to, say, countries that don't enforce intellectual property rights on goods. So say like on Rolex, right? All of a sudden, if you're going to buy a Rolex in a country that's got a history of not enforcing its rules particularly well, you're worried that, have you got the real thing? Is it going to work as well? And and obviously on a much more consequential scale than whether you've spent £10,000 appropriately on a watch, which is. But you live in Switzerland, so maybe I'm sure you've got 8. But
they don't like grow on trees here.
Ooh, come on, Calquin, elaborate. When trade nerds discuss vaccines, I realise what I must sound when I discuss trade policies.
I mean, do you caveat all of your statements about trade policies with how you don't understand anything? Because I tried to do that with vaccines. While Calquin decides, continues to mock us. Sam, okay, why is the US specifically backing this waiver such a big deal? In terms of it passing, first of all?
Well, it means that the possibility of there being a waiver now exists. Whereas before, the general assumption has always been that the US takes a pretty hard line when it comes to intellectual property, and its role within the global trading system has largely been on the side of extending its reach rather than narrowing it. And now all of a sudden it seems to have performed reverse ferret. It's considering something that was previously completely unimaginable, and this is news. Right? It's quite big news.
As we've already discussed, it means that potentially that diplomatic pressure might be off. There's a sense of whatever the law says. The fact that the US has basically done it now, it doesn't even, in some ways, like whether the waiver passes or not, the Biden administration's basically said, listen, if you want to come talk to us about making some on-patent vaccines and have us not, kick your door in a bit over that diplomatically, we're positively inclined to go in that direction. Whatever happens with the waiver. I think that's not nothing.
Yeah. It also more broadly just re-emphasizes that the administration in the US has changed, and whereas before unilateral action was its prerogative and its sort of go-to, now if the rest of the membership does have an issue, the US is willing to engage and discuss it rather than rejecting it out of hand. Now, of course, the politics of this have nothing really to do with COVID, right, in terms of resolving the issue at hand. But in terms of broader questions around the US's engagement in the multilateral rules-based system, in terms of its engagement with the WTO, it potentially does have positive externalities.
And look, the fact that the US could effectively be pushed into taking this step by, as we said, a combination of some domestic factors probably, but also by civil society activism. Like, it is very hard to imagine the Trump administration bowing to international outcry from civil society about helping developing countries at the expense of what are effectively US companies. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be somewhat out of character. Whereas here, I mean, it's a straight line. The US wanted nothing to do with this, not just under Trump, but the US as early as a little while ago was saying, like, we don't think this is necessary. And it was really in the face of this huge campaign that the US went, okay, well, we'll take a look at it now. And as you said, reversed decades of trade policy.
And now you have the EU going, and it's not just the EU, but it's also countries such as Switzerland, the UK, going, wait a second, are we the baddies? You know, it's like that meme, where, because IP is largely an area where the European Union and the US have been broadly on side. They might have some slightly differing approaches to, say, test data exclusivity periods and their precise length or the like, but generally they're in the same camp because they have the same sort of industry, the same sort of concerns. And now all of a sudden there's a schism, and you know, it's left. I think the EU slightly unsure where to place itself, and also the UK as well. There was a quite interesting, you know, Liz Truss put out a statement, you know, that was along the lines of, we were looking to work with the US on this and to discuss it further. But this is something where the UK is going, this is, we didn't expect or want this to happen.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny what's happening to the EU on this, because the EU thinks of itself as warm and fuzzy, and the US as sharp-elbowed. I mean, all of this kind of new stuff about assertiveness aside, Hans and Angus, thanks for joining us, and that's kind of it as well. As Sam was saying, this is the US signaling that it's a new day and trying to regain some of that international prestige. The fact that they did it without warning the EU they were going to do it suggested that they wanted that international prestige for themselves. They wanted those headlines of the US kind of change this course. And also, I think, to kind of throw an elbow a little bit, not just at the US, but a bunch of others. I can tell you, at the WTO, there are issues on which countries, not limited to the EU, including Australia, including others, hide behind the US. The US is used to being the bad guy on a bunch of issues, so that there are things that you know you don't want to do, but you don't want to say you don't want to do it, or you don't want to lead on things. So you wait until the US puts up its flag and says what it's going to say, and then you basically, you put up your own flag at the WTO and you go, well, you know, we actually do share some of the US's concerns. We're fully seized of what you guys are asking us to do, and we share your objectives, and we're deeply sympathetic. And we just think the US raises some really good points that need further explanation. And I think in the face of an objection from a country like the US, we really need to go back to the drawing board and move off this issue. Countries will do stuff like that all of the time, which must drive the US absolutely mental. Because it's effectively everybody using them as a human shield. You just pick an issue they care about too, and you let them be the bad guy on it. And in this case, the US kind of pulled a bait and switch on the EU and a bunch of others and said, no, this time we're gonna leave you exposed. We're gonna take a sharp step to the left, and suddenly you're in the firing line.
And now you're left with the EU going, wait a second, no, IP is important. US, you should start exporting vaccines, right? and you sort of get this sort of circular arc, which is one of the reasons why I'm not sure this wave is ever going to emerge.
Yeah.
because it's been a difficult issue for years, and the US changing its mind certainly shifts the weight in one direction, but it doesn't necessarily resolve it in the favour of, say, the South Africans and the Indians.
I would also say that I think just tactically, I'm not sure this EU, because all of the EU politicians who are a bit on the waiver, I just want to push back, came out and said, well, the EU's exported like 200,000 doses, or whatever it is, whatever the numbers of doses are, and the US has exported none, so they should step back. And I hear that argument, but that's very short-term thinking.
Yeah.
Because the US is about to start exporting so much vaccine that the EU is just not going to be ready to do. Because the US vaccination rate is so much higher, and their production capacity is terrifying, they are just going, very, very soon that argument's not going to hold water. Because the US is going to be, my guess is that within the next little while, you're going to see the US start to overtake the EU on vaccine export numbers. Not to mention the fact that the EU wasn't exactly blasé about the fact that it was exporting vaccines while not having enough for its own programs. So I'm not sure how well they've sort of thought that line of argument through to its conclusion.
What do you think about this? So this is the extreme skeptic argument, and this is put forward by some very intelligent people on Twitter, so I think it's worth engaging with, which is that countries like India and South Africa are going for the waiver because the normal approach of compulsory licensing, whilst that would allow for production to take place within their territories to service the domestic audience, is actually quite difficult to navigate if you want to export those vaccines. So therefore, countries such as India and South Africa want this waiver because not only do they want to be able to produce the vaccine domestically to supply their domestic population, but they want their companies to be able to then export it to the rest of the world and profit from it. So this is a very cynical argument, but it is one that I've sort of read on the internet recently.
There's an even more cynical argument than that, if you like, which is the fact that India and South Africa really like embarrassing the West at the WTO and on trade issues because they're hugely kind of trade is politicized at home, and it's a good look. It matches their position as champions of the developing world. And so tabling something like this that they knew would be really hard for the US to swallow and the EU to swallow back when they did it in August of last year. They knew this would put the US on the wrong side of this issue. It's a very easy issue to do messaging around. And so the absolute most cynical take is that they, vaccine aside, they saw an open goal and they knew that this would basically, snooker the US into defending something that is deeply unpopular. That's the maximal, that is cynicism, huge. That is WTO delegate for 6 years cynicism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think so that feeds into this argument that this is an attempt. They're seizing an opportunity to potentially gain access to technology and procedures that can then be utilized elsewhere and be of economic benefit.
Yeah. So this is Kaufman's point in chat that once you've built an mRNA vaccine production capacity, you can rapidly produce any new vaccine for the mid to long term. What do I think about that argument? My initial reaction is, so the nightmare scenario here is a lot more vaccine production capacity around the world. I appreciate the IP protection argument, but even if that's the case, the first reaction is, well, we need a lot more countries exporting vaccines. Secondly, I think it's worth kind of thinking about where India was at the start of this waiver request versus where they are now. Back when this request was filed, back in August, it seemed like India seemed to have the disease more or less under control. Rates were comparatively low, and there was a sense that they were kind of one of the success stories. So that might have been the way they were thinking. I think it's probably fair to say their focus has very much shifted domestically at the moment. to the point where I think they've introduced export restrictions of a type. Certainly the Serum Institute of India has started, I think, prioritizing domestic orders over foreign orders. So I think it's possible that was the argument, but as we've discussed, this requires a lot more than an IP waiver, and they know it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't build an mRNA vaccine production capacity, as Gartman says, just by waiving patents. You need these brought over. And I think waiver or no waiver, money or no money, probably fair to say that pharmaceutical companies will be somewhat tactical or strategic in to whom they deliver tax transfer. That's kind of my cynical counter take. I don't know how satisfactory you find it, Sam.
Yeah, pretty satisfactory. I don't know. I just struggle with this discussion in its entirety, in that I still just sort of come back to is this just a waste of time? You know, and I just want not that we've wasted our own time, we've wasted everyone's time this Monday evening, but you know, not necessarily that, but just insofar as it just doesn't feel, taking a very short-term view of just how do you do this as quickly as possible, this doesn't necessarily feel like the priority. But then, as you said earlier, it is possible to do multiple things at once. You know, governments aren't confined to just focusing on one thing at once. They're quite big organizations, institutions. They can be doing many different things. So, and maybe if you take it as a part of the whole, there's some use to it. But as soon as this basically goes back to, as soon as anyone says WTO negotiations to me, I just switch off for 10 years, and and then open my eyes just to see if anything happened.
So it's an inspiring thing to energize me as the director of the Geneva Trade Platform.
I'm so sorry. I've been a bilaterals guy, and it shows.
But I guess, you know, speaking of the WTO, I think it would be useful to just kind of talk through step by step what on the waiver specifically happens next.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So what happens at the WTO next on this waiver? So India and South Africa have basically said that they have been consulting on this, on their proposal text for, better part of a year or 8 months. They are now going to go away, take all of the comments they've received from members that they like on board, and submit a new proposal to the TRIPS Council. What is the TRIPS Council? The TRIPS Council is basically a committee that the TRIPS agreement set up within the WTO that is supposed to talk about how TRIPS is implemented. And what is the South African Indian proposal? Basically, it's a bunch of background and a bunch of sort of non-legally binding stuff, and then a couple of paragraphs of text that they want the WTO General Council, which is the senior-most committee of the WTO, that is basically meant to represent the will of ministers when ministers aren't in the room. So every 2 years, the WTO gets together for a ministerial conference, and that's supposed to decide big things. But when that isn't happening, the General Council is what makes the big decisions. And so basically, the India and South Africa will table this draft, which will include some draft paragraphs for the General Council to agree. The goal is then, inside this TRIPS Council, to have negotiations to get it to a point where 164 members can agree to it. The WTO is a consensus-based organization. It does not vote. There is no kind of weighted voting. There is no first past the post. There is only 100% mandate on that. So they have to get the language of this waiver to a point where every single member is fully comfortable with it and won't block it in the General Council when the General Council tries to pass it. That is, the US has already warned not to expect that negotiation to be quick. And I can tell you, having done it, it's really hard to get the WTO to agree any language on anything, especially something as politically sensitive as this. So what it's likely to be is a lot of formal meetings where they kind of look at this text and a whole bunch of behind the scenes diplomacy work as they haggle over the placement of commas, but then also some really substantive stuff about, okay, what does this waiver cover exactly? What constitutes a COVID vaccine? What are we waiving the patents for? how long is the COVID emergency? Like, is this a waiver in perpetuity? Is it a short-term waiver? All of these kind of different questions have to be negotiated kind of bit by bit by bit by bit until everybody is happy. Now, everybody is happy includes the EU, UK, Switzerland, and some of these other holders. So in order to get it to this next step, as we've already talked about, they have to get these guys on board. Now, Sam, if you had to guess, I had somebody in chat earlier saying Germany might now be the flag carriers for intellectual IP, for international IP rights. Do you think they're just going to be an in-principle no in the EU, or do you think they'll fold?
It's very rarely an in-principle no with the EU. It'll probably be a we're not sure about this, let's discuss it some more, and how long can we drag out these discussions for, and hope that in the meantime that the problem goes away, right? So that's what I think the most likely outcome is. That I do think that maybe towards the second half of this year the entire vaccine conversation is very different, with the EU having vaccinated most of its population, US having vaccinated most of its population. They're going to be exporting. There's going to be more available globally, and they're going to be some of the supply shortages we've seen as a result of, say, US restrictions on exporting certain bits and components. Once they go, things start to move a bit more quickly, and maybe the mood music changes, and people just aren't so focused on this at that moment in time. So if I were the EU or I was the UK entering into these negotiations, rejecting outright is bad politics. Mm-hmm. Look bad at home, look bad internationally, but I'm not sure about this comma. Oh, all vaccines or just these vaccines? Oh, I see that you want it to apply to treatments as well. Well, we're not sure about that. Have you considered?
And this is absolute stock standard WTO tactics, by the way. It is very normal when you are, as a government, confronted with a policy that is popular or that makes you the bad guy, which you don't want to pass. You can simply bombard the proponents, those who are advancing it, with 1,000 technical questions, asking for endless amounts of data and detail about the need and about the possible. You come back after everything that they send you. You say you're going to need to see legal advice, and then you wait like 3 weeks, and then you come back and you say our legal specialist asked, couldn't this be read as? And then you say something completely ridiculous, and they have to take it back to their legal specialists so that they can call your lawyers an idiot. Like there is a methodology to this, to the point where one of my thoughts when I saw the waiver was, is this what the US is doing? Is the US's plan? Because they don't want to be. They know they're going to be the face of blocking the waiver. They know that as long as the waiver is being pushed and the US position is no, it doesn't matter what it doesn't matter what like Switzerland is saying, that they are going to be the public face of opposition to this. The Biden administration doesn't like being the public face of opposition to stuff like this, but at the same time, the US is an IP juggernaut.
Right, and it's supported the idea of a waiver, not necessarily the waiver that was on the table. So
exactly, and it put right. When I saw that line from Captain K being like, everybody, like we're supportive, but keep in mind this thing takes a long time. I'm like, are they thinking they're going to slow roll this for months, either on purpose or just because this is a tough negotiation with 164 actors and some pretty weighty decisions to be made, and then basically wait until they're the ones exporting all of the vaccines. And as you say, the temperature goes down a bit, to use a poor choice of analogy. And basically the pressure's off them to do anything. Meanwhile, this is going to be a really opaque process.
Yeah.
These negotiations are going to be happening behind closed doors. I'm sure people will leak, but they're going to be over hugely technical questions and splitting the hair on the needle. And anytime anybody asks, the US, why are they blocking this? They'll say, we're not. We're fully engaging. We're trying to be constructive. This is just a really hard slog to get done.
So we need every country to not want to be seen as a bad guy, then it could sneak through. Perhaps.
Maybe, but even then, like this long technical negotiation gives countries the option of not being seen as the bad guy while being the bad guy. It potentially provides cover to throw a spanner in the works while very loudly proclaiming that you share all of the objectives of the waiver and you really want to get it done, but
but you've just got some technical questions about Annex 2,
exactly.
bullet point 3, yeah.
Yeah, or members are still discussing this, we're fully engaging, and that could be the strategy. I mean, I hope it's not, to an extent, because I don't think that's a really cynical way to approach the WTO on a pretty big issue. But it could well be the issue. And then, but kind of assuming this gets done, so assuming that they can find a version of this and the General Council adopts it, I mean, or generally I think the target is now people are banding around the ministerial conference in Geneva in December as the target date, which is already not soon. This is a figure this is kind of a date I've heard. So that could be the target. Maybe they get it done earlier, maybe they don't get it done at the 12th ministerial conference. And
look, we should probably say as well, if the US really, really wanted to get this done, right, and isn't approaching this from a cynical perspective or as a negotiating ploy, as we've discussed throughout this, are there levers it could pull that could potentially see it get done by the end of the year? Yeah, maybe. I mean, the US can offer a lot if it wants to, and it can get things to move very quickly if it wants to, especially on an issue like this where actually some of the usual holdouts are potentially on side.
Yeah.
So yes, but is it willing to offer that much? I don't know. I don't know.
It's so hard to read what the US approach is, how much skin they're willing to put in the game. At the same time, I'm inclined to say, look, if they are genuine, how many countries are really willing to publicly stand and face down the United States, plus every developing country on Earth, more or less, plus a good handful of the developed ones? Like, I mean, who wants to have that fight over?
And if the US
on this issue,
with saying, oh, and by the way, we on the basis of this, we're also going to unblock the dispute settlement.
Yeah, I mean, I think you overestimate how much people love the dispute settlement system. But yeah. I mean, there's a lot they could tie it to. Plus, also, as we've discussed, pretty soon they're going to be the ones who decide where vaccines go, because they're going to be the ones making it. So that's going to exponentially increase their kind of bargaining power on a lot of things. So anyway, this is all my way of saying it could get done, but we've already discussed the kind of potential consequences and the hurdles. The last step is, of course, having the waiver to take us right back to what TRIPS does. Just having the waiver. After that, governments need to actively decide through domestic legislation or regulation not to protect certain patents.
Yeah, and that will take time.
That will
so you've had Brazil recently, and this is a country that does like using the threat of compulsory licensing to lower prices. It already is quite au fait with the flexibilities of TRIPS, but it's currently legislating to make that process more streamlined, right? Because it's not quick enough. So this is a country that already is slightly skeptical of patents and their application in certain instances, and even they are thinking, well, actually, if we want to move quick on this, we need to change how we go about it, and we need to. So yes, the waiver comes in, and then you've got all of these countries going, "Ooh, okay, better pass some legislation," and then you have the domestic argument over it as well, because you will have domestic constituencies within those countries who are opposed to waiving intellectual property rights. I mean, you could see this fight in the UK, right? And it's difficult to call which way it would go.
Yep. So basically, it's a long journey. I think to kind of sum up the entire discussion, and we hope you found some of it helpful. Where we were vaguely in our lane, hopeful, is the US signaling this is a very big deal symbolically, and to the extent that waiving IP rights makes any kind of difference, just the US announcement of the waiver may help. But it's still a really, really long journey from today through to any likely adoption of a waiver. and an even longer journey before that adoption of the waiver translates itself into some genuinely kind of licenses that wouldn't have been there were it not for the waiver, and even longer until those are up and line in production. So this is a really big event, but at the start of a really, really long journey. Mm-hmm. Probably the way to sum it up. And as Sam says, there is still a ton of debate about whether tactically or strategically this was the kind of this was where the focus should have been. And there's kind of debates on both sides of that argument. Anything you want to add on vaccines, Sam?
No.
Excellent.
No.
In that case, because this has been so heavy, you have 3 minutes to share your completely foolproof and legally assured by Sam, not me, plan for becoming for anyone out there who wants to be a Brexit billionaire.
Right, yeah. So this is in reference to the first piece, first section of my last newsletter, and it's based on this idea that so in the context of Brexit, so Brexit is, from an economic perspective, if you take into account the sort of reputable type of analysis, a net negative for the economy over the long run, in that in 10 years' time, the economy will be slightly smaller than it would have been otherwise. But we do have to sort of understand that when you do introduce friction into any sort of trading relationship, but also regulatory friction in other bits of the economy, you do create jobs as well, because all of a sudden you need people to help you navigate this friction. So in the world of borders, we're talking about customs officers, customs agents, logistics people and the like, who can help you navigate all of these new concerns. And I'm sort of missing in this debate, because back at the beginning of the Brexit debate, we had so many sort of silly sounding interventions around putting the Irish border on the blockchain, having border zeppelins shooting blockchain at people to fix things and stuff. And it was all ridiculous and stupid. But actually at this point in time, you're going, well, there is actually a role for some of you people now to come in with some good ideas, because essentially we've created all of these costs for businesses trading, and largely all these costs amount to is complicated form filling with consequences. So here's a very complicated form. If you fill it out and get it wrong, you're going to get punished. Either tariffs would end up applying, or you won't get your good out of the country or not. But this sounds like something that actually someone could intervene in. And my sort of proposal here is that you just sort of create some jazzy interface, call it something cool, hashtag trade tech, hashtag customs tech, get everyone excited about it, because you've given it a hashtag and you're calling it, it's not finance, it's fintech, it's insurance, it's border tech, it's great, it's cool. And then you just pour in hundreds of millions of venture capitalist money for a few years just to undercut the entire rest of the market. And then at the point they've all disappeared and you're a monopoly, you start charging. And then scale up globally, you're a billionaire. That's the model. And I'm just slightly surprised we haven't seen someone attempt to do that at scale yet.
I mean, based on my conversations with people like Anna Grozoubinski, I think it's mostly because anybody who is capable of filling out a customs form has slept about 40 minutes in the last. Yeah, right.
So part of this. So part of this is that because you obviously need that. So to begin with, you have to have people doing all of this because you haven't automated any of it. And the hope is that over the 2-3 years of getting all of this data, you manage to automate about half of it or the like. You still end up, this exists for VAT. You still end up with, say, 1,400 staff having to do the hard stuff, but you can automate quite a lot of it. Yeah, you just pay them more. You double their money and poach them from other people. And, it's. I think this is going to happen. I'm sort of saying this in a quite tongue-in-cheek fashion, but this is absolutely what's going to happen. So someone somewhere is going to make quite a lot of money from this, and I'm slightly annoyed it's not me.
I'm sorry that you're not going to be able to launch the Dogecoin of UK border customs facilitation portals. That's unfortunate for you, perhaps somewhat less unfortunate for the good people of the United Kingdom and their trading partners.
No, it'd be good, right? Because, this is going to sound a bit mean towards customs agents, but they're a frictional cost. They shouldn't exist. As in, if it all functioned well, you wouldn't need them, right? So the only problem here is that you're potentially going to get a situation where the British government spends a lot of money trading up lots of customs agents, and then they get automated out of existence in 5 years' time, which would be quite brutal. But
I think governments the world over are used to training people up and then having like Deloitte coach them. So it's actually, I'm not sure how surprising they would be. Okay, so basically Sam's message is that if you have a couple of $100 million in venture capital, what you need to do is create a future monopolistic trade facilitation and customs entity that will ruthlessly undercut the market until it is the sole player, at which point it will begin gouging British firms for a cost that really shouldn't exist.
So, well, still less than what they were paying now, right? So if you're being sort of not so cynical about it, but yeah, I mean, you've just literally described nearly every tech company, so I don't see what the difference is.
Yeah, no, I was just showing you like that same pitch. That was how your pitch for the waiver sounded, like, Sam.
Yeah.
I was a stronger champion of your thing as you were of the waiver. All right, well, I guess now is the time when I get to plug your various projects. So, as always, thank you guys so much for joining us. Like to remind you that sometimes we write things. Anna Isaac, who can be with us today, is at Anna Isaac on Twitter, and she writes POLITICOEU's Morning Trade UK, along with some other talented writers. Sam Lowe is at Samuel Mark Lowe on Twitter, and he writes the Most Favored Nation Substack, where you can get great ideas like creating a monopoly to drive
to drive down frictional costs and benefit the British consumer.
Okay. So somebody's angling for an HMRC grant. And I am Dmitry Grozoubinski, and I'm the director of ExplainTrade, and I tweet at Dmitry Opines and have a website called ExplainTrade, where we try to explain trade. And that is our vaccine-focused show for this fortnight. We hope you can join us again in 2 weeks, where we'll find something else to talk about, and hopefully Anna will return to once again supervise us. Thank you, Sam, so much for coming on again.
No problem.
And I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys.
See you soon.